Hello there, and welcome back to the Sleepy Disclosure Project. Tonight we begin with a letter. A desperate king begs another for help. The enemy's at the gates, he writes. Send food, send aid, send anything. The tablet was found thousands of years later, buried in ash, unanswered. Within a single generation, every great power of the ancient world will fall. Egypt, the Hittites, Mycenae, all silenced by a force no one saw coming. So what happened? How did the most connected world in ancient history suddenly tear itself apart? But first, before we begin, if you find yourself genuinely pulled towards stories of mystery, conspiracy and forgotten lore, please consider subscribing. And if you truly like tonight's story, a gentle press on the like button or a friendly comment sure does go a long way to keep these journeys coming. Now, let's get back to tonight's story. Long before there were borders or rulers, water charted the paths that people would follow. The Nile shimmered under desert light. The Tigris wound through plains thick with reeds, and the Euphrates flowed with sediment and memory. These rivers were more than lines across land. They were the earliest roads into a shared future. Along their edges, sounds of wooden ploughs and rushing floods blended, marking a rhythm that bound survival to the soil. When the great ice sheets of the past age pulled away, meltwater carved openings into basins of abundance. In those new wetlands, people did something the planet had never seen before. They stayed. In fertile bands of silt, seeds took root and routines followed. Small groups that once tracked herds began tracing harvest cycles instead. They learned that the Nile's flood could be predicted by the stars and that digging channels could tame the uncertainty of a season. Over time, the steady surplus grew heavy enough to shape villages into towns and towns into cities. Clay bricks rose in the glare of early sun, their colour the same pale tone as the baked earth that supplied them. In Mesopotamia, workers lined irrigation canals while others stacked grain in warehouses whose scent drew every bird for miles. It was orderly and astonishing, people learning not only to live within nature but to remake it in measured lines. The rhythm of daily life expanded in the hands of those who needed count. When grain silos filled beyond memory, they marked baskets and jars with signs pressed into clay. The first scribes emerged here, not poets or priests, but accountants watching the flow of bread, cattle, and metals. Each tablet they left behind still speaks of trade, obligation, and care for the fragile balance that kept their river worlds alive. They were not yet thinking about distant strangers, but their lines hinted at it, the beginnings of exchange stretching past what any one kingdom could see. As populations grew dense, every floodplain's promise hardened into necessity. Wheat from one shore meant survival for another. Barley from upriver fed those whose own harvest failed. A missing boatload became more than an inconvenience. It became a warning. Interdependence crept in silently, unseen at first, until every temple and storehouse began to rely on goods transported through many hands. A shortage in the delta could ripple through mountains no farmer there had ever known. What started as cooperation became dependence, the invisible edge of fragility beneath the shine of progress. Clay tablets from Mesopotamia tell of long-distance trades, of expeditions seeking copper or exotic timbers far from river valleys. Across dunes and waves, Egyptian barges took similar journeys, moving copper upriver with the flood currents and carrying grain down in return. These voyages mapped a new sort of geography, one measured not just in miles but in expectations. Archaeological finds show that while Egypt baked bricks along its own floodplains, cities in Mesopotamia and distant Harappan towns were rising almost simultaneously. It was as if the idea of civilization had appeared in several places at once, fed by the same quiet understanding of rivers and rain. The same centuries saw the discovery of a miracle metal, bronze. Softer copper could be mined easily, but when blended with tin it transformed. stronger, sharper, more enduring. Bronze cut wood, harvested grain, and guarded borders. Yet neither metal alone could be found in all regions. Copper came from places like Cyprus and the Sinai, while tin travelled astonishing distances, traced to the highlands of what is now Afghanistan. That meant alliances. That meant trade caravans and merchants following stars across desert horizons. The alloy that armed armies and shaped ploughs depended on networks wider than any river could reach. In this way, bronze became more than a material. It turned into a measure of trust. Every blade or chalice carried the hidden labour of strangers. A Mycenaean chieftain could not raise his sword without trusting miners he would never meet. This dependence wove an unseen net over the ancient world. It turned geography itself into a smaller stage. Letters could move through it almost as easily as ships, their marks promising fairness, peace, or gold. In the soil of Amarna in Egypt, archaeologists later found tablets written by foreign kings calling each other brother, asking for brides or metal to secure the next season's fortunes. The words were polite, almost tender, shaped by necessity more than affection. Parallel lives unfolded far away. Along the Indus River, baked brick cities laid out in perfect grids traded beads, cotton, and finely carved seals. The script on those seals remains undeciphered, yet their presence in Mesopotamian ruins shows that merchants once carried them across thousands of miles. The Indus, the Nile, and the twin rivers of Mesopotamia did not act in isolation. They pulsed in something close to rhythm. Surplus and scarcity alternated like notes in the same long song, and somewhere between them moved messengers crossing languages that did not yet have names for one another's gods. Picture one of those messengers at dusk, his sandals crusted with salt from the Persian Gulf. He moves through caravanserai smoke, carrying a clay packet sealed with the mark of a distant ruler. Behind him, donkeys shift restlessly under the weight of blue lapis from Afghan mines. Ahead lies a merchant waiting by the river gate, whose water mirrors the first evening stars. The transaction he plans tonight might decide the number of ploughshares a kingdom would craft next year. To him it is business, to us it is the fragile thread from which a global system began to hang. As these connections intensified, the logic of the world turned inside out. Power no longer came only from land or armies, it came from access. A scribe in Thebes could track copper consignments arriving from Sinai and record their weight beside deliveries of grain, while a ruler in Mesopotamia might measure status in the reliability of his tin brokers. Geography flattened under the weight of correspondence. What once took generations to spread could now travel along well-marked trade routes guided by both stars and contracts. The distance between empires felt shorter, though few travellers understood how quickly that shrinkage would one day prove dangerous. Archaeologists studying this time speak of parallel bursts of architecture and administration, so similar in method that they could almost be branches of the same government. Stone measurement blocks from Egypt match weights unearthed near the Indus. Cylinder seals from Sumer bear images of ships nearly identical to those on the Nile. Even artistic styles seem to echo one another in shape and gesture. The world was learning the art of standardization, and that efficiency carried a quiet cost. It erased buffers, made systems interlock so tightly that stress could travel through them like a wave through a woven mat. After the long summer heat, artisans retreated to their furnaces. The air filled with metallic wine and smoke tinged blue from the smelting fires. Those men and women, their faces streaked with soot, could not see beyond the glow of their own work. They poured molten copper into moulds, listening to the hiss as air escaped. To them, each ingot meant wages or food. None could imagine their fire lakes of metal were building the foundations of empires they might never hear named. Their craft connected to miners on distant islands and to caravans tracing ridges under cold stars. A global organism was breathing for the first time. Its pulse felt through anvils and river ports. Meanwhile, priests watching floods recorded the cyclical moods of water. They saw how too little rain brought hunger and too much destroyed fields. Yet even those who tracked the stars missed that the balance they worshipped was becoming precarious. As long as barges arrived and granaries filled, the system seemed eternal. But behind its smooth functioning lay a math that allowed no room for interruption. Lose a mine, lose a fleet, lose a harvest, and the mechanism would begin to stall. Fragility hid beneath stability, a truth still recognizable in any economy bound too tightly to its own optimism. Some whisper that early myths of divine punishment, the plagues, the tempests, the floods, were memories of real precarity misunderstood through reverence. To see the world depend so completely on the favour of skies and seas must have felt like subservience to unseen gods. Yet these stories may also have served as warnings told in the only language available. They hinted that nature itself had the final word, even over kings who called other monarchs brother. The river cities flourished for centuries under this delicate contract. From their ports left cargoes of ivory, cedarwood and textiles. Into them arrived metals and ideas. Tools improved, palaces grew, writing hardened into tradition. But beneath the apparent security, every advance tied them tighter to distant lands. The same connections that enriched them also bound them unreversibly to one another's fortunes. Like strands in a net pulled taut, they could bear great weight but only as long as each corner held firm. In a sense, these floodplains became mirrors of our own networks. Each innovation promised safety by making survival collective. Each success increased fragility by expanding that collective further outward. The same boats that united regions could just as easily carry hunger if the upstream tide of supply failed. The irony lingered in the silt like a caution unspoken. The more complete the connection, the more absolute the consequence when it broke. By the time bronze tools outnumbered stone, the first global pattern had taken shape. Markets rose where priests once prayed. Scribes became as powerful as generals, because every tax, every shipment, every promise of tin or copper passed through their hands. The sound of styluses etching wet clay echoed across warehouses. Bureaucracy, the wordless backbone of trade, was born from the same need that had once carved trenches for irrigation. Civilization was no longer a village dream. It was an administrative machine humming on ledges and rivers. Even so, human moments persisted inside that machinery. At dusk, fishers along the Levantine coast mended nets threaded with bronze hooks. Children pressed their palms into the mud to make toy carvings of ships their families traded from. A potter in Ur added a personal mark to his jars, not for vanity, but as proof they came from trusted hands. These details, small and ordinary, carried a warmth the archives rarely show. Each choice left some trace within the enormous web of exchange now spanning continents. As dusk lit the riverbanks in red, the age of bronze shone with an almost untouched optimism. Everything seemed possible. No one standing among those golden fields could have guessed that dependence itself would become the fault line. The rivers had carried humanity from isolation into contact, from chance harvest to planned abundance. And now those waterways, so faithful to the rhythm of sun and moon, had also made the world too connected to ever unwind. The first global web was forming. Not digital, but molten, strung between smiths, farmers, traders and kings. It pulsed with promise, and with every spark in the furnace its strands grew stronger. Yet within their gleam lay tension, a quiet vibration waiting to unthread. Because that web, stretched across deserts and seas, would soon reach its limit, binding kingdoms into a shared fate none of them would be able to escape. Every sword, plough and chalice of the Bronze Age owed its life to two distant mines, copper and tin thousands of miles apart. One gleamed beneath the sun-soaked slopes of Cyprus, an island whose stone veins glimmered green where copper pushed through. The other hid in the rough highlands of what's now Afghanistan, where tin was pried from the earth in narrow mountain passes that froze even in summer. Betwixt Between those two ends of the known world stretched the oldest global supply chain known to history, a network kept alive by wind, sweat and trust. Each link in that chain hummed with the rhythm of wooden ships, caravans of donkeys, and the hands of merchants who may never have met but still shared the same heartbeat of trade. Cyprus was the copper heart. The island's name, Kypros, even gave the metal its later word, copper. In the Bronze Age, its mountains were bored with tunnels and pitted with furnaces. At night, fires from the smelters lit red against the cliffs like anchored stars. Ore was dragged from dark shafts and melted into smooth, loaf-shaped ingots. These shapes, known as oxhide bars, were made for travel. They could be lifted by hooks or roped over pack animals. They stacked neatly in the belly of a boat and could be traded hand to hand across borders where words failed but metal spoke clearly. Every bar was a promise of weapons, wealth or survival. Tin was rarer, far more valuable. Its traces led east through deserts and mountains to Central Asia. The distance between tin and copper forced civilizations to talk, to sail, to negotiate. Metal needed metal, and humans became its couriers. Along the way, languages bent and blended. Traders learned enough words to count shipments and swear oaths. Translators became prized commodities themselves, walking dictionaries on dusty docks who could make or break a deal. Between the islands of the Aegean and the valleys of Mesopotamia, the same ritual unfolded. A stranger offering metal that came from nowhere near here, a king inspecting the sheen, and a scribe pressing clay with the record. This was not mere commerce. It was mutual dependence dressed as prosperity. Egypt could not arm its armies without northern copper. The Mycenaeans needed eastern tin to forge ceremonial blades that shimmered in royal vaults. The Hittites bartered grain and silver to keep their forges burning. The Canaanite cities, those narrow ports strung like lanterns along the Levantine coast, served as stations in a metallic relay. Each of them relied on the other's stability. A single storm at sea or a broken treaty could ripple for hundreds of miles. The nearer the system approached perfection, the easier it was to unmake it. Archaeologists once raised from the seabed a ghost of that world, a ship that went down near Uluburun off the Turkish coast. The wreck had lain undisturbed for over 3,000 years, cargo intact. Inside were hundreds of copper ingots from Cyprus, each still stamped with the ancient shape of its mould. Near them were bars of tin, smaller but weightier in value. Alongside the metal rode jars of resin, ivory from Africa, glass beads, and scraps of precious blue stone. It was a floating summary of the Bronze Age, its commerce, its artistry, even its fragility. The ship itself was stitched with linen rope, held together by precision and patience. It had once creaked with wind and traded whispers across the deck. Now it told its story from the quiet floor of the sea. The metals inside that vessel carried the entire world's ambitions. Bronze didn't just make weapons, it created the ploughs that fed cities, the chisels that framed temples, and the mirrors that reflected kings. Power no longer came from how much land a ruler controlled, but from how much metal reached his workshops. Metallurgy replaced agriculture as the true symbol of universal progress. The Mycenaean warrior's sword and the farmer's spade drew from the same stockpile. They were twin offspring of one alloy. Wealth flowed through ports, not fields, and the monarch who could guarantee the flow of bronze could also guarantee peace, or war, on his own timetable. Some villagers in Cyprus lived entirely by the smoke of smelting. You can almost see one of them at dusk, a craftsman standing by the furnace mouth, face painted orange from the glow. His hair smells of ash and sea salt. Behind him, the wind lifts sparks that scatter into the dark like fireflies. He cools a new ingot by turning it with a rod of green wood, unaware that his molten creation might travel farther than any living man he knows. It could ride east toward Babylon, west to the Aegean, or south to the Nile. Wherever it goes, it will fuse strangers into partners, kingdoms into customers. None of them will remember his name, but every one of them will depend on the gleam that left his fire tonight. The metallic web that sprang from such furnaces ran invisibly over the sea. Egyptian barges, Hittite envoys and Aegean captains all traced its currents. Through harbours layered with foreign scents, cedar, pitch, goat hides, came the exchange of goods and gossip. A Hittite officer might hear of drought near the Nile before his own ruler did. A Babylonian merchant might learn of unrest in Crete, while bargaining for lapis on the coast. News, rumour and inventory moved along the same routes. The web was the ancient world's nervous system. When it tingled, the whole body of civilization flinched. Each of these transactions left traces buried deep in the dirt. Small bronze fragments, bits of weighing stones, broken seals with names long eroded. Archaeology unravels them like pieces of circuitry, mapping how cities such as Ugarit or Alalak functioned as relay points in a traffic that never truly slept. The scale was larger than most imagine. Items found on the Uluburun ship came from at least 7 regions. It carried African ebony, Persian tin, Anatolian ceramics, and Egyptian jewellery. To coordinate such movement, port officials must have maintained schedules, scribes, and stockpiles with astonishing precision. The Bronze Age was never primitive in its organisation. It simply lacked machines that could automate its intent. Yet in that precision lurked danger. When a society depends on connections stretched across seas and mountains, security becomes illusion. A delayed convoy could mean a factory without copper, and soon after, a kingdom without armour. Drought in one region could dry up both crops and commerce. The fall of a single fortress could scatter miners, erase a supply line, and strand hundreds of workers. No one built safety nets because no one believed the machine could stop. In a sense, the Bronze Age invented the idea of systemic risk without ever naming it. Consider how elegant and fragile the machinery truly was. Cyprus loaded copper onto vessels shaped for stability more than speed. They relied on wind patterns that looped seasonally across the eastern Mediterranean. When those winds shifted or weakened, trade stalled. Inland, tin caravans wound through mountain passes that froze solid or flooded during snowmelt. A single ambush or lost guide could halt shipments for months. Empires downstream, Egypt with its standing army, the Hittites with their sprawling bureaucracy, depended on those unseen travellers. They were the arteries of every palace economy. If the pulse of trade stopped, prestige followed. Caches of unfinished bronze tools discovered in Anatolia suggest workshops caught mid-process, metal cooling while artisans waited for shipments that never came. Letters from royal archives scrawled in cuneiform mention payments delayed, promises unfilled. The tone often borders on pleading, one ruler asking another not for favours, but for tin. Reading them is like hearing the first creaks of a bridge just before it gives way. Meanwhile, in the far corners of this network, some communities must have sensed the imbalance. The miners who hacked at veins of tin in the Afghan foothills, the sailors loading ingots onto narrow ships, the farmers selling their grain to provision caravans. They all stood nearest the hinge of history but would never guess it. Each believed their role modest. Each completed their task so the next could begin. But when dependency runs too deep, modest links hold impossible weight. Bronze transformed the human story in one elegant formula: 9 parts copper, 1 part tin. That ratio forged blades that kept an edge longer than stone, ornaments that shone brighter than day. It also forged an illusion that human cooperation itself had become indestructible. For centuries it seemed true. The shores of the Aegean flashed with workshops, Egyptian tombs filled with treasures that could not have existed without those distant miners. Somewhere above them all, the wind sighed over an invisible lattice of trade routes, both delicate and vast. The Uluburun ship hints that such interconnection was self-aware. Its cargo was too varied, too deliberate. There were goods meant to impress diplomats and supplies for craftsmen, all packed together as though the ship's purpose was to nourish the system itself. And yet somewhere midway along its voyage, something went wrong. Whether it was a storm, piracy, or crippled navigation, the ship sank. The wreck in hindsight looks more like a warning than an accident. Every bar of copper that slipped into darkness symbolized one more bond temporarily severed. Multiply that across many routes and you can sense how easily equilibrium could collapse. Centuries later, those who examine the data, geologists, historians, oceanographers, describe this economy as the first true globalization. That term might sound modern, but its substance is ancient. Separate lives linked by need more than by choice. Distance shrank under the pressure of necessity. By the time bronze dominated, geography had ceased to be a boundary. It had become a corridor. And like all corridors, it could close with the turning of one lock. Even technology, that proud banner of progress, hid its limits. Bronze could not be made without tin, and no one ever found a substitute within easy reach. The alloy's chemistry chained empires to pure geography. It bound their destinies to physical veins of ore scattered across continents. When those veins stopped feeding the furnaces, people learned how brittle civilization's glow could be. The Cypriot smelter cooling his ingot probably heard the same sea that carried his livelihood away. He must have trusted its rhythm. Ships came, ships left, and life filled the pause between them. His children might have played near slag heaps, reshaping waste metal into toys. Generations lived like that, sustained by the confidence that trade would always return with dawn. No one could foresee a time when the smoke would fade, when the ore tunnels would flood, and when even the word for bronze would lose meaning. That trust was the web's final flaw. So long as every kingdom obeyed the shared rhythm, the network thrived. The moment one faltered, through drought, war, or empty mines, each neighbour felt the echo. The first tremors came too subtly to name. Ships delayed, harvests lightened, the market murmured of shortage. Most dismissed it as weather, as timing. But the cracks widened quickly, travelling along the same paths that once carried fortune. Dependence became the very thing that undid the system. The bronze web had given humanity its first global machine, a marvel built not of gears but of obligation. It enriched artisans and armed nations. It made deserts shimmer with distant wealth. Yet every machine has a point where tension outpaces strength. For the people who lived through it, the realization came too late. They heard the silence between arriving ships stretch longer each season, and they waited for sails that never reappeared. The first tremors, as it turns out, appeared not in politics or war, but in the sky and soil themselves. Across the late Bronze Age, power meant correspondence. Clay tablets travelled farther than armies, carrying the weight of whole kingdoms in a messenger's satchel. One might hold a greeting from Pharaoh to the great king of Hatti, another a plea for grain, another a marriage proposal written in stylus grooves still visible today. The air around these letters was thick with heat and formality. Scribes folded them in clay envelopes, sealed them, and pressed the mark of their master's ring before passing them to couriers who would take weeks, sometimes months, to cross deserts or folded seas. The kings of Egypt, the Hittites, the Minoans, the Mycenaeans, the Babylonians, and the Canaanite city-states formed a fraternity of power that treated distance as a technical problem, not a barrier. Theirs was a world where the word brother meant survival, and even gold could serve as an apology. Each of these lands glowed differently on the map. Egypt's heart beat along the Nile, feeding a bureaucracy that counted grain by the bushel and soldiers by the thousand. The Hittites ruled from the Anatolian plateau, where citadels rose behind thick walls of limestone, their archives filled with oven-dried treaties. Crete's Minoans built frescoed halls open to sea air, while the Mycenaean kings on the mainland favoured fortresses heavy with fortification and fear. Babylon still shimmered along the Euphrates, its ziggurats standing above a landscape of marsh and mirror water. Between them stretched the Canaanite ports, tiny yet vital. that translated language, measures, and coinage as if all kingdoms spoke through them. The difference in dialects, gods, and prestige mattered less than the rhythm of exchange. The Amarna letters cast this network in miniature. Hundreds of tablets, now hardened in museum light, preserved the daily diplomacy of that system. When a shipment of tin delayed, a king's patience could curdle into threat. One demanded more gold as the bride price for a daughter already promised. Another begged forgiveness for neglected tribute, blaming pirates or delayed envoys. Their tone ranges from intimate to urgent, like correspondence between relatives who no offence could mean war. Phrases repeat, my brother, my son, my equal, but the formality cannot fully hide the anxiety beneath. They wrote endlessly about gold, lapis, and metal, but the most valuable currency was reliability. To keep the bronze supply flowing, loyalty itself became standardized. Tokens, marriage treaties, and ceremonial exchanges provided proof of good faith. A Hittite princess might sail to Egypt as a bride, guarded by servants and interpreters, carrying dowries of linen and perfume. The journey was both celebration and test. Her arrival certified that peace would hold another season. Lapis lazuli stones, likely from Afghanistan, glinted on the hands of officials in cities that had never seen the mountains those stones were born from. Shared myths travelled too, legends of storm gods, divine births, and universal floods, bending local tongues into a common grammar of belief. Where caravans could not go, rumour carried their ghost. Some whisper that this tapestry of diplomacy was its own technology, an invisible machine powered by etiquette, myth, and the weight of promised shipments. Each palace chamber served as a node, and each scribe a processor in the flow of data that kept kingdoms aware of one another's moods. Egypt's pharaoh might issue a decree from Thebes, and within weeks the tablets would echo it in Ugarit, Tyre, and beyond. The formality of these letters masks a remarkable simplicity. Their international communication without paper, metal, or code, just baked earth and patience. Now and then that patience ran out. There's one letter from a Babylonian ruler complaining that Pharaoh sent too little gold, accusing him of deceit. The tone is indignant but exhausted, as though both men knew their wealth was no longer what it seemed. Another king, likely from a coastal Canaanite city, pleads for reinforcements against raiders near his border. Supplies promised in the spring have not arrived, and hunger creeps closer. These small frustrations shimmer between the lines. Each complaint signals a tremor in the grand balance. These letters don't simply describe trade, they measure the psychological weather of the ancient world. A courier's life reveals the human scale behind it all. You can almost see him. Leather sandals coated in dust, eyes cast to the horizon where the next settlement might appear. He carries a pouch of clay messages sealed with the images of gods he doesn't worship. He may never learn what the symbols mean, only that losing them could cost his life. When he delivers one to a city gate, another scribe will chip open the casing, unroll the clay, and find the marks left by a man weeks dead. In that delay, diplomacy existed both in real time and in ghost time. Every message was both new and already obsolete. Critics counter that calling this an early global system stretches the geography. After all, their reach covered only parts of the Mediterranean and Near East. But supporters suggest it behaved like later global networks, with each kingdom functioning as a hub. Cyprus sent copper, Babylon managed grain and textiles, the Hittites controlled overland routes through Anatolia. Egypt's abundance made it both provider and financier, its gold soothing grievances before they became wars. The Canaanite cities held the wires together, relaying goods and gossip through harbours that smelled of fish, tar and resin. On clear days, a sailor leaving Boseblos might see the faint outline of a Cypriot ship coming in from the open water, both crews knowing their cargo was part of the same unseen pattern. The deeper this coordination grew, the thinner its tolerance for failure became. a treaty with the wrong phrasing could stall an exchange. The death of one king could render half a continent unsure which successor to trust. A drought in Anatolia might delay grain exports to Crete, forcing Mycenaean merchants to seek credit from Egypt's treasuries. Each solution created another strain somewhere else. From modern eyes, it looks less like a map of kingdoms and more like circuitry, a set of loops, feedbacks, and fragile tolerances. The more stable it appeared, the more delicate it truly was. One wonders how these rulers perceived themselves inside that lattice. Did Pharaoh sense that his wealth depended on miners digging in foreign hillsides hundreds of miles away? When the Hittites prepared tribute, did they realise that the value of their tin was set by shortages far east of their own horizon? There's an almost modern echo in their language of dependency. They traded not on faith alone, but on shared risk. A harvest failed in one place, and every ledger quivered. Archaeological traces confirm this web scale. Sealings from Egyptian archives bear Hittite symbols. Fragmentary amphorae in Mycenaean ruins contain resins traceable to Canaan. Even decorative motifs, spirals, lions, sun discs, passed from palace to palace, subtly changed yet recognisable. Culture flowed like any other cargo. The fine details of art and ritual reveal how long peace could last when abundance moves smoothly. Yet they also show how rapidly fashion and faith could die when interruption came. Supporters suggest that in this gilded traffic of goods and marriages, a shared illusion formed, that diplomacy could outlast environment. The Amarna archives read like the heartbeat of that illusion, constant, rhythmic, and convinced of its own continuity. But the letters stop abruptly. There is no concluding message of apology or retreat, no final warning. It's as if a symphony simply ended mid-bar because someone snuffed out the lights. The replacement of one monarch could silence half a dozen conversations at once. Without communication, the entire system began to misread itself. A single example captures that fragility. After the death of a Hittite great king, Egypt seems to have lost track of succession there. Envoys hesitated, unsure which son now ruled. Trade paused, tribute stalled, and neighbouring states who relied on those routes found themselves stranded in uncertainty. What followed wasn't immediate war, but something quieter. Shortages, broken contracts, and the creeping realisation that each palace was more dependent than it wished to admit. The wax of stability had begun to melt under a slow and distant heat. Yet even inside that precarious network, beauty persisted. One letter closes not with demand but affection, a simple hope that the other's household and gods remain in peace. Across language and ocean, that sentiment carried something human and enduring. It's possible the sender felt the fragility and wrote as much to comfort himself as his counterpart. The written word gave form to a promise that everything was still intact. For a little while it was. The collective enterprise of these kingdoms created perhaps humanity's first shared horizon. No empire could claim independence because none could survive without the others. Egypt's stone temples, Hatti's archives, Crete's frescoed corridors, all drew their colour and texture from trade routes that traced an unbroken line of exchange. In that sense, the Bronze Age achieved what every later age would attempt, a balance between independence and entanglement. They reached it with discipline, ceremony, and a belief that words could manage risk. That belief, more than bronze itself, kept the lights on. But as with any complex system, equilibrium came at the cost of flexibility. When every mechanism is tuned to perfection, it loses the ability to bend. The diplomacy of brothers and gifts could not easily accommodate failure. The Hittite envoys who once navigated the Anatolian roads would soon find them blocked by lands too poor to pay for maintenance. Ships that carried the same luxury goods began to vanish, victims of weather, piracy, or simple insolvency. Each disruption fed another. The elegance of that connected world masked its own unravelling. The kings writing to each other might never have imagined how synchronized their fortunes truly were. A delayed shipment in one port translated into famine in another far inland. A misinterpreted letter led to insult, then retaliation, then silence. Their world operated on what we might now call network logic, a concept millennia ahead of its language. They built a civilization made of correspondence, trust, and fragile symmetry. It ran smoothly until the variables multiplied beyond its capacity to adjust. By the end of that age, the couriers no longer crossed the deserts, and the tablets they carried turned to archaeological puzzles for someone else's curiosity. Yet reading what survives, the rhythm of that civilization can still be felt, the pulse of an ancient internet beating through clay instead of code. It was humanity's first attempt to bind the world with words and promises rather than conquest, to operate on shared faith in the movement of ships and messengers. The design was exquisite. Its flaw was inevitable. The smoother the system ran, the more catastrophic its stall would become. Long before the palaces burned, the trees had already stopped growing. In the quiet valleys around the eastern Mediterranean, their rings froze in time, thin, brittle lines marking years when rain never came. The oaks along the Crete hills retreated upward, their leaves curling in dust instead of dew. Across the coastal plains, farmers who once measured life by the flood of rivers now measured it by the cracks on their fields. The warning had arrived softly in pollen and soil, long before armies or invaders appeared on any horizon. Centuries later, scientists would read those trees like scrolls from another world. They would dig cores of ancient timber buried in sediments near the Dead Sea and lift strands of pollen trapped since the Bronze Age. Under microscopes, the grains told a story written without ink. Olive, oak, and carob all dwindled abruptly around 1250 BCE. What followed was not a single dry season, but a curtain of parched decades that never fully lifted. The evidence wasn't gathered from a single place. It came from caves, lakes, and even the shells of tiny creatures that once swam the Mediterranean surface. In a cave in Greece, stalagmites preserved the slow drip of prehistoric weather. When scientists sliced through those limestone pillars, they found chemistry that spoke like breath from the past. Layers rich in certain isotopes revealed centuries of retreating rain, a pulse of drought that aligned across multiple continents. To the untrained eye, the rock looked ordinary, smooth, grey, steady, but its minerals carried a rhythm more relentless than any chronicle. Dryness, enduring dryness, measured not in years but in lifetimes. Beneath those same skies 3,000 years ago, the great Bronze Age world still seemed unshakable. Egypt's temples glowed in the sun, the Hittites held their highland capitals, and the coastal markers of Canaan still traded in luxury dyes. Yet all of it leaned on a single truth: crops fed kingdoms. When the sky faltered, every ledger, military, religious, economic, began to blur. Wheat stopped obeying the seasons. Goats wandered farther for scrub. Wells shrank to bitter puddles. Outside palace kitchens, silos emptied faster than scribes could count them. Modern research tracks this unravelling not through myth, but through residues of life itself. Sediment from the Sea of Galilee holds faint shifts in colour that match declining vegetation in neighbouring lands. Cores drawn from the Mediterranean floor show a layer dense with dust, a fingerprint of erosion from withered plains. Even plankton, microscopic and patient, recorded the decline. They flourished when rainfall washed nutrients into the sea, but around the same fateful century, their populations collapsed. It was as if every part of the ecosystem whispered the same unsettling phrase: the water is leaving. The term scientists use for events like this is mega-drought. It describes not a single failed harvest, but a generation-spanning absence of rain so deep it reshapes entire societies. In the Bronze Age, irrigation could buffer famine for a few years, maybe a decade. But when skies withheld for centuries, artificial canals could only delay loss, not defeat it. The soil hardened. Salt crept upward through fields. Even hardy grains could not survive repeated years of failed floods. For a civilization rooted in abundance, that slow drying was more lethal than war. A team from Tel Aviv University pieced together data from across the Mediterranean, comparing cave samples, pollen counts, and carbon records. What startled them wasn't just the drought itself, but its coordination. Every region recorded the same disruption almost simultaneously. From the Aegean to the Sinai, a single timeline emerged like a fracture visible through glass. Critics offered alternate explanations at first. Volcanoes, shifts in trade, even disease. But the climate trail gathered evidence too clean to dismiss. Each test, each sample, pointed toward the same prolonged aridity. The word collapse sounds sudden, but the climate's hand was slow, steady, exhaustive. It began with erratic seasons. Farmers replanted again and again, chasing clouds that formed but never broke. Herds grew thin, then vanished. Officials taxed harder to fund imports of grain, but the ships arrived later and lighter. Letters between kings turned from ceremony to plea. How do you sustain divine order when the gods seem to have abandoned the sky? Archaeologists have found traces of these unanswered questions etched in desperation. At Megiddo, one of the key Canaanite cities, the lower strata from this era contain hearths, filled not with grain but with weeds, wild seeds roasted as substitute food. Perhaps an old farmer crouched there, turning cracked soil between his fingers, trying to understand why his gods had withdrawn their favour. The land that once glimmered with irrigation channels now dulled under a haze of blown dust. The rhythm of sunrise and harvest broke. When that man looked up, the sky must have seemed unchanged, blue, wide, indifferent. But it had betrayed him quietly. From his view, the empire beyond the horizon was eternal. Egypt's monuments, Hatti's roads, the endless bureaucracy of Mesopotamia. None of it appeared perishable. Yet each shared his dependence on predictable seasons. Palaces could store food, they could not summon rain. Wealth meant little, once the fields stopped feeding the ledgers carved into palace stone. The deeper the drought bit, the more fragile the global network became. Coastal harbours once so busy with copper and timber now watched their ships idle. Tribute payments slowed because provinces could no longer feed themselves. A letter found at Ugarit hints at this thread unravelling, a local ruler begging for grain that never arrived. The courier probably never finished his journey. The city was destroyed soon after. Centuries later, when scientists gathered their samples and plotted them on modern graphs, the pattern spoke with an eerie symmetry. Around 1250 BCE, rainfall dropped sharply. Within decades, forests gave way to shrubs, streams turned intermittent, and by 1150, entire lowland farms had been abandoned. Across the chart, the data points rose again only after several hundred years. Civilizations had collapsed long before the climate recovered. It was not a brief failure of weather, but a sustained transformation that demanded new ways of living. Supporters of the climate hypothesis suggest that these centuries of stress united other forces, migration, rebellion, warfare, into one rolling disaster. Drought didn't swing the sword, they note, but it weakened the hand that held it. Critics counter that empires have faced dry periods before and survived, pointing to Egypt's resilience through earlier Nile fluctuations. Yet even there, temple inscriptions begin to echo distress around this same era. A subtle shift from divine praise to anxious gratitude when floods returned even modestly. Those prayers reveal fear seeping through a hierarchy once thought immune to hunger. Let the frame widen for a moment. Across the expansive geography of the Late Bronze Age, variables of culture, faith, and power differed, but their climate did not. A single corridor of drying air reached from the Aegean to the Levant. The same atmospheric pattern darkened skies above Troy, Thebes, and Ashkelon. Each kingdom, though proud and separate, shared the same sky's decision. And that may be the most haunting part. They never understood it was global. Each believed their crisis was local wrath, their drought their own punishment, never guessing the same parched wind carried through their rivals' banners. Today, those clues linger in the unlikeliest archives. A stalagmite in Kataraki Cave carries the faint yellow trace of a century of dust storms. Lake Larnaca in Cyprus hides a brown layer with almost no pollen at all, a sterile chapter, proof that vegetation nearly vanished. Marine scientists dredging cores from the Mediterranean speak of a grey horizon, a thin stratum marking dead plankton and sudden sediment influx. Together these records tell of skies that rained in margins only, while coastlines stretched outward and once green valleys turned to gravel. Humans survived, but not unchanged. Villages splintered, migrations began. Some groups moved toward the sea, scavenging trade routes long enough to spark conflict with coastal cities. Others turned inland, seeking untouched springs. These displacements may have created the restless bands later remembered as the Sea Peoples. Families turned wanderers by thirst. The drought had rewritten geography. Where once lay clear borders, there were now only moving fringes of settlement chasing what water remained. Even within the dry data, there's poetry. The thickness of a tree ring, the sheen of a cave droplet, the chemistry of marine dust, all record the breath of lost civilizations. The scientists studying these remnants sit under flickering lab lights, gloves powdered with limestone residue, reconstructing centuries from fragments smaller than a fingernail. Each result crosses nations, timelines, and tongues, yet everyone hums the same rhythm: less rain, more dust, rising heat. The story grows undeniable in its monotony. Climate became fate. Some whisper that cycles like this are inevitable, that the earth has always swung between fertility and desolation. Others argue the collapse was unique, sharpened by the vulnerability of a system stretched to its limits. Both may be true. What turns natural variation into catastrophe is dependence, the same invisible thread that had bound Egypt to Cyprus, Hatti to Babylonia. Once that thread frayed under changing weather, nothing could hold the weight. Return now to that farmer at Megiddo, alone, hands rough from failed harvests. He might have looked north toward unseen mountains where clouds once gathered. He didn't know that geologic records 3 millennia later would confirm his despair. His life was the human version of those drought curves drawn centuries after his dust settled. Somewhere nearby, an official counted rations, a scribe pressed cuneiform letters into wet clay, and a priest whispered offerings to gods of water who no longer answered. The Bronze Age collapse would later be remembered as a convergence of war, famine, and invasion. But the earliest tremor was silent, chemical, patient. The trees had already told the story before the scribes did. Beneath the ground, the future of empires was drying grain by grain, and once the harvests failed, everything built upon them, trade, temples, trust, would begin to fall in sequence. The ships that once carried wealth now drifted half empty or vanished entirely. Their crews waited on calm seas for cargoes that never came. The wind still filled their sails, but the destinations waiting beyond the horizon had stopped answering. Somewhere inland, storehouses stood bare. In palaces from Thebes to Hattusa, the silence between incoming messages grew longer. The very rhythm of Bronze Age trade, once as predictable as the tides, began to hesitate. The economy of that era was a web wound tight around its metals. Cyprus hammered copper into ingots shaped like stretched ox hides, stamped with marks of origin that moved through ports like passports. From Afghanistan came tin, precious for the small miracle it made possible when fused with copper, bronze, the alloy that turned soft metal into usable strength. Egypt shipped grain north through Canaan. The Hittites sent timber and horses in return. Every kingdom's prosperity depended on the others. Wheat, wool, timber, gold. Each travelled a path that touched every shore of the eastern Mediterranean before returning home as weapons, tools, or offerings. It looked like stability. It was, in truth, a balance so fragile it could crack beneath its own efficiency. When the skies turned against them, the first fractures appeared. A few dry seasons might have seemed survivable, but the drought that spread across the region around 1200 BCE stretched on for generations. Farms growing along once regular rivers yielded less each year. Grain stored for trade was eaten at home instead. A single stalled caravan from Anatolia could leave a city-state near starvation. And when storms failed to return each winter, shipping lanes filled not with merchandise but messages. Pleas for food, for tin, for promise. Letters found centuries later preserve that anxiety in neat, cuneiform lines. A governor begging his counterpart across the water to send even one cargo of bread. "There is famine in my house," he writes, the wedge marks pressing deep with urgency. But across the sea, the same plea waited unread. At Ugarit, once the financial centre of the North Syrian coast, the docks grew eerily still. Ash layers in its ruins show ships destroyed in port before they could flee. Warehouses that once stored copper ingots and purple dye collapsed under their own charred beams. Archaeologists found half-written tablets there, accounts left unfinished, contracts awaiting confirmation that would never come. A scribe's hand ended mid-stroke, a vertical line fading where the stylus hesitated. Perhaps he heard distant shouting down at the shoreline. Perhaps he thought he would finish later. Far out along the water routes, the world of merchants and sailors began to unravel. Bronze weights that once glinted under Cypriot sunlight lay forgotten aboard drifting hulls. In the shallows near Cape Chelidonia, modern divers discovered a trader's ship lying heavy under centuries of silt. Its cargo still held shape. Copper ingots packed neatly in rows, tin nuggets in jars, amphorae nestled around them to keep balance. The vessel had gone down midway between one great economy and the next, like a stranded thought between languages. Other wrecks dating to the same years appeared the same way, laden, directionless, victims not of battle but abandonment. The shipping lanes had become graveyards of an age that still believed itself alive. Each failure bred another. Once foreign tribute stopped arriving, palace treasuries could no longer pay soldiers or labourers. Those soldiers turned inward, raiding their own neighbours for what little remained. Taxes went unpaid, inspectors disappeared, archives were left unlocked. Political alliances, delicately written on clay, dissolved overnight. When ivory and gold could no longer buy loyalty, kings fell back on crops and walls, and both were failing. Even mighty Egypt, which had outlasted countless storms of foreign invasion, began to feel the strain from within. Workers at Deir el-Medina went without rations and walked out of the quarries in protest, leaving Pharaoh's tombs unfinished in the Valley of the Kings. The economic architecture of the Bronze World bent under a hunger that no decree could undo. Across the broader network, letters multiplied like symptoms. Between city-states that had once exchanged poets and princesses, the tone hardened. In one tablet from Ugarit, a ruler warns his ally that ships from the west have been sighted near his coast. He pleads for reinforcements, but also for wheat. Even the armourers had ceased their shipments. No bronze, no defence. There is a sense, reading them now, of leaders trapped inside an invisible prison. The logistics that had bound them in prosperity now holding them as they starved. The same roots that brought wealth became lines of dependence, and when those lines snapped, isolation returned to the shores. Some historians describe what followed as a network collapse, where a complex system disintegrates not from one failure, but from the sudden interaction of many. A missing supply of tin meant no new tools for farming. That smaller harvest led to fewer shipments of grain. Hungry artisans abandoned workshops. Soldiers left barracks to feed their families. Ports closed not by order, but by exhaustion. Once one node vanished, the pressure spread like a wave across connected cities. And because each believed the others would recover, No one noticed the web dissolving until only fragments remained. The drought did not create enemies, yet desperation did. Ships once bright with trade emblems now carried fighting men. As lines of credit turned into lines of refugees, the sea seemed to fill with restless fleets searching for a shore that still held food. To the coastal rulers who survived only on stored grain, every sail on the horizon blurred the line between merchant and marauder. The old agreements couldn't survive a world where even bronze, the measure of order, was fading from accessibility. The merchants themselves must have known the danger first. They saw the routes empty month after month, watched the harbours fill with idled vessels. There's a haunting image preserved through archaeology, an Ugaritic tablet, unfired and brittle, found just inches from a doorway as though dropped in haste. The words translate to an order for tin, urgently requested, with an unfinished tally beneath it. Perhaps the scribe meant to note the price once confirmation arrived, but confirmation never came. Outside his office, he might have heard the crash of stone walls giving way, or the rumble of ox carts crowding the streets as families fled inland. The ink of antiquity is clay, and clay keeps the pauses. Every kingdom tried its own solution. Egypt tightened control over its granaries, rationing grain carefully among the temples and the military. In Anatolia, the Hittites sent their emissaries north for timber to rebuild fleets but found the harbours already deserted. The Mycenaean sites on the Greek mainland, Pylos, Tiryns, Mycenae itself, grew heavily fortified, ramparts thick with fear instead of prosperity. Warehouses filled with amphorae waited for ships that never docked. Under the weight of the sun, they began to crack from within. A pattern was forming that none of them could see fully, as if each kingdom were a single instrument no longer tuned to the others. For centuries, messages, currencies, and promises had kept tempo. Now the rhythm stumbled. Economies that had once been measured in tons of cargo slipped into whispers about missing deliveries, about traders gone missing, about harbours haunted by smoke. The concept of empire, so modern in its reach, began to fray not because of conquest, but because the scaffolding of commerce fell away. Even the scribes who survived long enough to record their own ruin adopted a different tone. Their final letters are personal, weary. Some speak to gods, others to partners far across the water they can no longer reach. The bureaucratic formula of request and reply breaks under panic. A few carry signs of rewriting, sentences smoothed over, as if the writer feared the words themselves were dangerous should they reach the wrong ruler. In them you can hear the sound of old certainty collapsing into improvisation. Archaeology provides glimpses of this unravelling more eloquently than any document. Along Mediterranean coastlines, entire trade stores were abandoned intact. Amphorae sealed, ledgers stacked, doors bolted from the inside. On land, caravan routes once lined with guard posts and watering stations stand empty in the strata, their roads quietly buried by shifting sand. The more connected a city had been, the quicker it vanished. Complexity had been its lifeblood, and now it was poison. So the system did what living systems often do when strained. It contracted. Populations retreated inward, trading over smaller distances, farming defensively instead of for export. Bronze workshops that once sang with hammer and fire went cold. The grand notion of universality, the idea that the world itself could be one marketplace, slipped out of reach. Where there had been confidence in ocean routes stretching unbroken from Anatolia to Egypt, there now lay only suspicion. Yet amid all this withdrawal, the sea stayed open. A scattering of new sails appeared on the horizon, unfamiliar, unmarked. To the few surviving kings who kept watch from their battered cities, these drifting fleets looked less like traders and more like omens. Stories would call them the Sea Peoples. Whether they came as conquerors or as desperate wanderers fleeing famine is still debated, but their arrival marked the final phase of the old order's undoing. The great trading ports, once lit through the night with fires from forges, offered them nothing but ruins. The last surviving records show Egypt preparing defences even as its inland bureaucracy faltered. The rest of the network had already crumbled. The Bronze Age world, so proud of its interdependence, had engineered a kind of trap. When the flow of goods stopped, no single power could stand alone for long. There was no fallback plan, no reserve economy, no alternative circuit. The miracle that once united the known world, the steady pulse of trade across water and sand, had become the very weakness that destroyed it. The ships that remained at sea tried to anchor to fading memories of order, but their maps had turned meaningless. Beyond the horizon, entire coastlines lay dark, cities replaced by plumes of smoke. The silence between ports stretched farther each month, until the only orders left were those scratched hastily onto clay, never sent, never answered. Into that silence, the new fleets kept coming. Egyptian temples tell of ships arriving from nowhere, crews of unfamiliar faces armed and silent. The stone reliefs still carry that moment. Dark hulls cutting through a narrow band of the delta, oars lifted in eerie rhythm, waves curling around them like folded cloth. The figures on deck raise round shields and spears, their hair drawn in strange loops, their clothes unlike anything from the Nile Valley. In quiet chambers behind those walls, scribes carved every detail, naming their pharaoh's triumph over an enemy no one had seen before. They called them the peoples of the sea. No homeland, no single ruler, only motion, entire nations adrift. At the mortuary temple of Medinet Habu, Ramesses III ordered scenes of a naval battle to be etched for eternity. Rows of Egyptian archers line the shore, drawing bows so taut the strings nearly vanish. Their targets, a flotilla hemmed in the shallows, women and children among them. Beneath the carvings, columns of hieroglyphs retell the story of Egypt's salvation. Yet, even under the glare of victory, the carvings seem anxious. The enemy looks scattered, desperate, families bundled into ships dragging their world behind them. If you look closely, one figure drops a child into another's arms as their boat lists in the tide. The record speaks of conquest, but the image wonders if these were wanderers more than warriors. The Sea Peoples, as modern scholars call them, are a mystery stitched into late Bronze Age ruin. Their names drift across Egyptian inscriptions like half-heard echoes: the Pelest, the Shekelesh, the Luka, the Denian. Each appears once or twice, then disappears again, like fragments of a broken chorus. None left their own writing. None built a city we can point to and say, here their story began. Their presence is known only through the wreckage that followed them, as if the ancient world felt them before it saw them. The Hittite cities fell. Ugarit, the great port of trade, burned to its foundations, and Egypt, though it survived, was left scarred, its granaries hollow, its networks cut. What could have driven so many disparate peoples across the sea at almost the same time? Supporters suggest that the drought spreading through the eastern Mediterranean acted as the first push. The rains failed in the Aegean long before they went silent on the shores of Canaan. Fields browned, storage jars emptied, and small coastal societies began to loosen their roots. Hunger travels faster than rumour, and as each harvest faltered, one migration triggered another. Villages turned into fleets. Fleets turned into swarms of displacement, and by the time they reached Egypt's frontier, desperation had gathered its own strange discipline. Others dismiss this environmental cause as too simple. They point to hints of social collapse among the Mycenaeans and the Hittites, palaces revolting against their kings, mercenary bands cut loose after failed campaigns. In this view, the Sea Peoples were not one people at all, but a collision of many fractured groups, pressing outward from lands in crisis. Farmers, soldiers, artisans, children, each carried only what they could haul aboard a vessel or strap to a mule. Seen this way, the invasion of the Delta becomes less like an assault and more like an exodus. The The carving scenes of chaos might then be what happens when starving migrants meet terrified defenders across a floodplain both sides call home. Archaeology adds small, shivering clues. On the shores of Sardinia, the stone towers of the Nuragic builders keep watch, their spiral staircases rising through volcanic rock. Weapons found in their ruins resemble those shown in the Medinet Habu reliefs. Curved swords, horned helmets, round shields of hide. Some whisper that among the sea peoples were western sailors from these islands, drawn east when the balance of the Mediterranean shifted. The resemblance does not prove identity, but the shapes of tools sometimes travel before the hands that wield them. Across Crete, Cyprus, and the Levant, weapon designs converge in a way trade alone cannot explain. Something moved through these waters, both material and human. Consider, too, the rhythms of the sea itself. In years after drought, the wind changes. Dry air thickens over Anatolia, the northern coasts sink into silence, and ships drift toward whatever currents remain. Fishermen pressed into war crews would have felt it in the sails first. The wind weaker, the sky yellowed at dawn. For them, leaving might not have felt like conquest but necessity. One can almost sense it in the monument's uneasy symmetry. Enemies carved with the same precision as Egyptians, boats mirrored against boats, destinies locked together by the water between them. Standing on the delta in that age, an Egyptian archer would have squinted toward the glint of bronze far out at sea. The tide pushed the invaders closer as the marshes hissed beneath the sun. He would circle his hand over his bowstring, hands slick with river salt, waiting for a command that came too late or too soon. In front of him, the sky filled with sails. Each one was a roof torn from some burned homeland. Each one held people convinced there was nowhere left to turn but forward. To that archer, it must have looked less like war and more like the Nile itself had risen carrying ruins. Ramesses III's victory is written in the certainty of stone, but stone can't lie perfectly still forever. Archaeologists examining those same layers find that behind the triumph was famine, workforce strikes, and corruption in the royal granaries. Egypt repelled the attacks, yes, yet the cost could not be hidden. Dwindling rations, temples starved of offerings, and the slow slippage of an empire fighting the tide in every direction. The Sea Peoples may have been defeated, but their arrival marked the beginning of an unravelling. Egypt would never again command the foreign minds that fed its wealth. Its stone inscriptions would soon narrow from boasting to prayer. The names on those inscriptions, Pelest, Shekelesh, Luka, Denian, have since inspired entire genealogies of speculation. Some link them to ancestors of later Mediterranean cultures, Philistines in Canaan, Lycian sailors in Anatolia, even shadow lines connecting to the ancient Illyrians or Greeks. Critics counter that these patterns rely too much on phonetic coincidence, the way names can echo across languages without lineage, yet the temptation persists because the Bronze Age leaves silence where history should begin. One broken link in the chain of names, and the human urge to fill that gap with story begins its patient work. Among the relics recovered from the waves, shards of pottery, bent spearheads, fragments of burnt timber, there are hints that the so-called invaders blended into the very worlds they helped unmake. The coastal plains of southern Canaan show abrupt shifts in pottery style soon after the war's end. New motifs of birds, fish and ships scratched into clay. Some archaeologists frame this as acculturation, the merger of local survivors with seaborne refugees. Others see it as occupation under another name. But whichever way one turns the evidence, it reveals the outcome of any vast displacement. Once people have moved together through catastrophe, separation becomes almost impossible again. The Late Bronze Age saw its seas not merely as boundaries but as bridges. Sail-powered contact threaded the ancient world into a single, uneasy unity. When those stranded populations arrived in the delta, they struck the most visible part of that unity, but the vibrations carried deeper across an already weakened web. the destruction that followed their migration looks less coordinated than contagious. Where famine met panic, where panic met anger, cities lit their own skies with fire. The sea people sailed into a world already leaning toward collapse, and their arrival tipped what remained. In the centuries since, the image of barbarian fleets assaulting civilization's edge has hardened into myth. Textbooks often call the event the invasions of the sea peoples, as if chaos had roots and schedules. Yet the more evidence accumulates, the less certain that phrase feels. Drought, rebellion, and migration intertwined so tightly that one cannot say which began the spiral. A convoy of ships leaving one starving island might trigger a flight on another shore. The pattern reads almost systemic, the Bronze Age world redistributing its human load like shifting sand. Modern researchers tracing ancient DNA through skeletal remains have begun to sense the subtle footprint of these centuries of movement. Genes once isolated in distant corners of the Mediterranean now appear blended along the coasts of the Levant and North Africa. The touch is faint but real, a watermark of nomads turned neighbours. Such findings don't rescue the details of those names carved on Ramesses' walls, but they whisper that, whoever they were, they stayed. Their blood mingled into later generations, their myths folded into regional lore. The invaders, in the end, became part of the very history they once threatened to erase. Among the surviving fragments, a particular small bronze fibula, a pin used to clasp garments, was dredged from the mud near the site of an ancient delta fortress. Its design matches one found in Sicily, from roughly the same century. Two identical gestures of metal separated by hundreds of miles of sea. A coincidence, perhaps, or a trace of mingled peoples long after the arrow volleys fell silent. The artifact's curve catches the light the same way the carved waves at Medinet Habu once did, reminding us that stories travel best when carried in the hands of those who have lost everything. As the 12th century BCE unfolded, those who had fled hunger found their arc of survival narrowing. Egypt fortified its frontiers, Cyprus rebuilt around smaller harbours, and the survivors of Canaan anchored in coastal enclaves that later cultures would inherit. In time, those harbours gave rise to the Phoenician traders, master sailors of the new Iron Age, who would reclaim the sea not with invasion, but with exchange. It is tempting to think the memory of the older wanderers persisted in their craft, the urge to cross the horizon, but never again with nowhere to return to. At dusk, the delta would glow copper beneath its low sun, and the marshes hum with insects over bones that once filled ships. An Egyptian worker scraping pigment over temple walls might pause and sense the same dry wind that carried those fleets here decades earlier. To him, history was already becoming rumour, the crowds of foreigners reduced to carved lines and stiff poses. He could not know that his own empire was fraying even then, its wealth drained by the defence its leader celebrated. Victory had been recorded, stability had not. Later, chroniclers described the reign of Ramesses III as Egypt's last blaze before the shadows lengthened. Behind the facade of divine order, tax systems tangled, tomb workers went unpaid, and internal conspiracies simmered in the court. The sea peoples faded from the hieroglyphs, replaced by pleas to the gods for sustenance. Stone outlasts famine, yet famine writes more deeply into the living than any chisel could mark. The pharaoh's enemies had not conquered him, but they had shown how fragile a world of plenty could become when the seas, the harvests, and the alliances all failed together. And so the story of the sea people stands halfway between history and mirror. Were they destroyers or displaced families? The evidence says both, perhaps, depending on which shore one views them from. In their wake, the Bronze Age closed its eyes. Kingdoms that had spoken to each other in gold and grain fell quiet. Egypt's carved victories endured, but behind the reliefs lay the faint beginnings of decline, the slow collapse that even triumph could not conceal. Because while Ramesses III defended his frontiers against the storm, The storm had already entered his walls. On papyrus, Ramesses wrote of triumph. His scribes carved the words deep into temple stone so the gods would never forget how he defended Egypt from the sea peoples, how he stood firm while foreign kingdoms burned. The hieroglyphs still gleam under torchlight at Medine Habu, each stroke a monument to endurance. But beneath that polished surface lies a quieter story. A king balancing famine, revolt, and illusion at once. In the delta, where shallow water meets shifting sand, Egypt's last great army waited behind timbered walls and reed barricades. Scouts watched the horizon for sails that might carry refugees or raiders, or both. The marshes trembled under the weight of chariots and oxen, the air damp with the smell of mud and sweat. Ramesses ordered trenches widened and boats lashed together to form floating barriers. Shields glinted dull in the morning haze, and the soldiers who carried them were thinner than their ancestors. Each ration of barley now mattered as much as any spear. When battle finally came, it was chaos at the meeting of river and sea. Archers lined the embankments, releasing volleys toward foreign hulls painted with symbols no Egyptian could read. The warships spun and collided, flaming arrows setting their rigging alight. The pharaoh's inscriptions later told of victory, of invaders driven back into the waves. Yet even in triumph, the delta stank of rot and hunger. Corpses drifted among reeds as fishers tried to salvage nets for food instead of war spoils. What the stone calls peace felt more like exhaustion given form. Where those victories were written, the ink of frustration thickened. Records from later years show temple rations shrinking, granaries going unfilled, and wages paid late to artisans who built Egypt's sacred tombs. The Nile no longer flooded as predictably, leaving some valleys baked to dust while others drowned too briefly to plant. A subtle rhythm that had guided generations failed, and no ritual could coax it back. Ramesses may have stood at the head of an army, but his true enemy was the absence of rain. Inside his own palace walls, the danger grew quieter but closer. The harem conspiracy, an intrigue nurtured among royal wives and advisors, crept into motion, while Egypt's defenders still patched their wounds. Whispers moved through the corridors about plots to replace the aging pharaoh. Some suggest it began with jealousy, others with despair at dwindling fortunes. Whatever its spark, it marked the rot of an empire turned inward. The image of divine kingship, once unshakable, now depended on guards who had not been paid in months. Meanwhile, the grand administrative machine that had kept Egypt prosperous began grinding down to noise. Scribes recorded petitions that went unanswered, deliveries that never arrived, bricks stolen from temple sites to repair crumbling homes. In Thebes, workers at the royal necropolis laid down their tools and refused to continue tomb construction. They weren't demanding riches or status, only bread for their children. It became the world's first recorded labour strike. Letters from overseers plead for calm, describing men sitting in the road, hungry but unarmed, waiting for rations that never came. The protests subsided after officials distributed leftover grain from temple stores, but its echo lingers in every carving meant to declare Egypt's order unbroken. In the cities, merchants and potters tried to stretch thin supplies across long distances. The copper that once arrived by sea had dwindled to fragments, forcing smiths to recycle old ornaments into tools. Even the priests, who relied on state support to maintain the temples, began cutting corners in offerings and ceremonies. Statues once gilded now kept their stone skin bare. The scent of incense that had defined Egyptian ritual thinned as resins from foreign lands stopped arriving. A civilization that built gods out of sunlight found itself counting every ember. Yet Ramesses remained determined to preserve the appearance of control. At Medine Habu, walls recorded impeccable victories. Precise formations toppled enemies, divine favour guaranteed. Every line of stone certified stability in a world visibly cracked. In reality, his scribes struggled to staff scribal schools, apprentices trained on reused papyrus, scraping off old texts to write new prayers. Temples that were once centres of abundance now rationed beer and bread to their own workers. Still, at festivals, a smiling pharaoh processed through the streets as musicians beat tired drums, their rhythms masking the quiet panic beneath. The Nile itself told the truth more clearly than any inscription. Sediment layers from that era show dry years repeating, the floods too low to replenish the soil. Fishers lifted empty nets. Farmers turned to managing smaller canals and shallow wells, hoping the groundwater might outlast their patience. In relief carvings, the river still swells huge and bountiful, but archaeologists reading the gate debris find bones of cattle, too small for their breed, signs of starvation disguised under ceremony. After the Sea People's threat faded, Egypt's strength remained hollowed out from within. Trade partners had vanished. Shipments of tin, oil and timber ceased altogether. Without those links, even simple repairs grew impossible. The great bronze tools that symbolized power became relics, their gleam fading to dull green. The bureaucracy tried to mimic the gestures of the earlier ages, tax, census, decree. But paper decrees could not irrigate fields. The empire was alive only on its walls. Some whisper that Ramesses resorted to elaborate rituals meant to reassert divine order, summoning the favour of Amun for floods that never came. He built on credit drawn from faith. Each temple addition promised an abundance no ledger could prove. To the common Egyptian, however, the magic of hierarchy no longer guaranteed food. The boats of grain that once sailed from Nubia or Canaan failed to dock. In their place came drifting rumours of cannibal fields, families selling heirlooms for beer jars filled half with sand. At Deir el-Medina, where the artisans of the royal tombs lived, hunger arrived as an unmistakable guest. Accounts carved into limestone fragments tell of guards bribed with leftover bread, foremen negotiating loyalties one loaf at a time. Each man's complaint reads less like rebellion and more like exhaustion, the tone of people whose civilization asks more than they can give. By the end of Ramesses' reign, many tomb projects halted completely. The afterlife had lost its builders. Ramesses himself aged inside the stone symbols crafted to conceal decay. His statues towered over a kingdom dwindling behind them. Even now, the colossal seated figure at his mortuary temple stares out toward desert horizons, serenity carved into granite. But beneath its gaze, the foundations once supporting it cracked and were patched with limestone. When later dynasties inherited his image, they saw a monument without its empire. Words still existed, but the machinery that maintained them, scribes, archives, storehouses, had become ghosts. Egypt endured in form yet shrank in substance. The army stayed active, but its equipment rusted. The temples opened their gates, but fewer pilgrims came. Taxes were collected in promises rather than goods. The economy became a memory acting out its own pattern long after the pulse had faded. Still, in the grand narrative carved across temples, there is no mention of famine, no whisper of protest, no climate slipping out of rhythm, only tales of victory, tribute, and divine favour unbroken. Historians studying those reliefs see the contradiction. They read beneath carved lines for missing grain accounts, half-finished records, abrupt changes in chisel depth. The artisans themselves may have hidden meanings between figures, battle scenes where soldiers stare toward nothing, perhaps aware that their victory is only symbolic. What the official narrative hides, the texture of stone quietly reveals. Some Egyptologists suggest the king's divine persona required perpetual mirage. To acknowledge weakness would invert the entire religious order. That tension between image and reality held Egypt together for one generation longer than the rest of the Bronze Age world. The deception brought time but not healing. By pretending strength, Egypt survived the collapse's wave, though much of its energy went into maintaining illusion rather than rebuilding strength. Ramesses' monuments became anchors of memory for a people moving through scarcity. They kept the idea of Egypt intact even as the daily experience eroded. The temples echoed with hymns more out of tradition than conviction. Scribes repeated old blessings, the same ones used when the flood cycle was still predictable. Over years, that echo hollowed into habit. Civilization became repetition, the same script written by fewer hands each generation. Under starlight, the capital quieted. The once crowded embankments, where cargoes had lined up 3 deep along the Nile, stood nearly bare by the end of his reign. Grain barges still floated, but many sailed without cargo, a theatre of continuity for anyone watching from the palace balcony. To the farmers farther upriver, this ritual charade carried no comfort. Hunger respected no iconography. Yet the endurance of Egypt's image carried power of its own. When neighbouring kingdoms disintegrated, their stories fell silent. Egypt, by contrast, had the language and artistry to mythologise its survival. It taught later dynasties how to use the past as structure, history as currency. Ramesses' campaigns, though fought at the edge of starvation, became the blueprint for royal resilience across centuries. The message written in stone outlived the truth it once sought to hide. The man himself was eventually embalmed with the same artisanship denied his starving subjects. His tomb, completed long after his victories faded, shows a calm not found in the documents of his reign. When archaeologists first uncovered his mummy, they found the body intact but the wrappings patched with lower-grade linen, repairs made during times of shortage. Even in death, scarcity followed him. It's as if the empire's fatigue clung to its ruler's very skin. In the epic rhythm of Egypt's story, Ramesses III stands as both saviour and symptom. His power delayed collapse, his grandeur masked it. The drought-bound Nile whispered the real verdict, slow and steady, cutting through illusions more completely than any enemy blade. Each diminishing flood carried a quiet message upstream. Survival demands more than victory. What the pharaoh wrote in ink declared eternity. What the river wrote in silt said otherwise. Egypt would endure centuries longer, but its Bronze Age heart never beat the same again. Its monuments stayed bright under the sun, its cults continued their hymns, yet the network that once joined it to the wider world was gone. Perhaps that is the meaning of survival in collapse, not endurance of body, but of memory. And as Ramesses looked out across his still land, he may have known it. Across the sea, the night glowed faintly red as distant palaces burned and their languages fell silent. In Greece and Anatolia, entire languages vanished between one harvest and the next. Linear B tablets, once pressed neatly with the rhythm of bureaucracy, hardened into clay by accident, baked in fires that consumed their own archives. Palaces that had glittered under bronze sunlight now lay under several layers of charcoal. What records hadn't burned were buried under ceilings that melted and collapsed around them. The traces we find today, collapsed mud brick, fused fragments of cups, walls scorched to red glass, outline not a battle, but a disappearance. One season taxes were collected, the next the scribes no longer wrote. The palace courtyards that echoed with chariot wheels fell into a long waiting quiet. Archaeologists tracing these layers notice something uncanny. The pattern repeats from mainland Greece to western Anatolia, from the ruins of Pylos to the empty capital of Hattusa. Destruction layers, as they call them, stack within the same generation. The earth itself seems time-stamped by disaster. Collapsed roofs, toppled columns, and stores of grain left to rot inside sealed rooms. This synchronicity unsettles scholars. It was as if the known world blinked out along a single arc of latitude. Some whisper that the tremors of the great earthquake sequence that struck the Aegean near 1220 BCE marked the first blow. Others counter that war alone could not leave such even scarring, and that famine and abandonment must have walked alongside it. The Mycenaean citadels, strongholds perched on ridges above terraced farmland, were not simple towns but command centres. They directed the harvest, distributed metals, and kept records on every sack of wool and amphora of oil that passed the gates. Those records burned with everything else. Without the palace administration, fields shrank back into private plots. Herds disappeared, herded by refugees instead of overseers. The once ordered world narrowed again to what could be carried or bartered within sight of each valley. Some survivors may have rebuilt in rough wooden forms where stone once stood, but the memory of central control slipped away. Farther east in the Anatolian highlands, the Hittite capital endured a fate just as final. Its walls, 11 kilometres long, still snake through quiet hills where grass grows thicker in the outlines of temples. In the strata beneath, archaeologists find signs of siege but not conquest. Broken gates, ash thicker than soil, skeletons unburied in collapsed corridors. Grain stores were emptied before burning, suggesting famine came before fire. Letters from the final kings had grown increasingly desperate, pleading for shipments of grain from their coastal vassals that never arrived. When those ports fell silent, the inland palaces could no longer live off the sea's roots. Months later, the city vanished from record. The scale of the collapse tempts the modern mind to search for a single villain, a weapon, a plague, an invention turned wrong. Yet the evidence shows fragments of everything intertwining. Storms left harbours unusable just as the drought reduced crops. The failure of one port rippled outward to its trade partners, who relied on that grain or bronze in return. The interlocking design of Bronze Age civilization magnified every shortage. One broken link became 10. Merchants stranded on foreign shores became wanderers. Wanderers, when hungry long enough, became raiders on the same routes they once traded. Among the ruins of Pylos, charcoal outlines of furniture still mark the palace floor. Near one threshold, a cluster of tablets, unfired when written, was hardened by the blaze. The last entries recorded weapon allocations and mentions of Watchers of the Strait. Some archaeologists think the scribes sensed what was coming, issuing armour in haste as columns of smoke rose along the coast. One can picture a scribe crouching by the wall, clay between his hands soft from the summer air, carving orders even as bits of ceiling drifted down. The record ends mid-word. After that, the stylus fell and the world grew wordless. The silence that followed was not brief. For centuries, Greece kept no writing. Trade, once measured by lists and seals, shrank to barter between villages. Tombs reveal fewer goods and simpler tools. To later generations, the era of the palaces became a distant legend spoken around fires, the memory of gods and heroes that classical poets would reinvent as myth. When writing returned, around 800 BCE, it used a new alphabet borrowed from Phoenicia. The shapes were different, the sounds rearranged. The scribes no longer remembered the old syllables or their meanings. Civilization had rebooted without its original code. In the Hittite lands, even the language itself was forgotten until modern times. Stone blocks with wedge-shaped characters rested half-buried in rural fields for millennia. Farmers cut them apart for building stone, unaware that these were the last words of an empire. When a German engineer stumbled on them in the 19th century, the text spoke a tongue that had no living descendants. The voices of the kings were sealed behind a script no one could read. Only through coincidence, bilingual fragments unearthed in faraway archives, did their words flicker back into comprehension again. The gap in human memory between the fall and that rediscovery stretches longer than the entire written history of their own empire. The archaeological signatures of this collapse, when lined up on a chart, form a grim rhythm. Around 1190 BCE, layer by layer, cities blink out. Ugarit on the Levantine coast burns. Troy shows evidence of siege and fire. Mycenaean centres from Tiryns to Thebes fall within a few decades' margin of error. Each trench tells the same story. First, the fine pottery ceases, replaced by coarse hand-shaped versions. Next, imported wares disappear. Finally, the local debris layers thicken, signalling abandonment. even the cemeteries thin out, it is not only that people died, it is that fewer remained to bury the dead. Some researchers turn to the geology itself to explain the scale. In the sediments under Aegean harbours, they find traces of tsunami deposits, sand driven far inland around the very years of unrest. Others find signs of massive landslides on the Anatolian fault line, as if the crust of the earth took part in the collapse. None of these causes alone fit cleanly, yet together they sketch a crossroads of disaster. The sea rising, the sky drying, the soil shaking. In such a combination, no city of the age could have stood long. Kings who measured power in bronze had built on foundations that shifted beneath their feet. Yet human decisions mattered too. In the final letters of the Hittite court, traders appear accused of hoarding grain. Officials blame one another for treason and theft. Such details show not simply natural disaster, but the unravelling of trust inside the system. When central granaries failed to feed their workers, temples and households began hoarding what little they had. As loyalty fractured, the great bureaucracies that once bound thousands of people together could no longer function. Collapse grew less like an explosion and more like slow rot. By the time enemies appeared at the gates, the heart had already stopped beating. The Mycenaean world, known for its warrior aristocracy, may have turned that violence inward. Fortifications were rebuilt in panic, with hastily added walls enclosing springs and gates barricaded with stone. Some citadels show signs of civil strife, fire beginning within storage rooms, not at the perimeter. What looks like invasion may have been revolt, farmers and labourers rising against systems that could no longer sustain them. Others dismiss that idea, arguing that invasions from displaced coastal groups, perhaps survivors from the earlier coastal destructions, pushed inland. The physical evidence does not choose a side. It only shows that when smoke cleared, the palaces never rose again. In the years that followed, trade routes drowned in rumour. Merchants no longer sailed by royal charter, but by guesswork or desperation. Some ended up on distant islands in the Italian or Iberian seas, where traces of Aegean-style pottery appear among new local wares. Cultures blended in odd fragments, tool designs from Anatolia beside decorative styles from Crete. This patchwork hints that refugees carried pieces of their past into new worlds. Yet the core regions, where kings once ruled over archivists and courtiers, stayed empty. Sheep grazed where scroll rooms had stood. Time itself seemed to have stopped collecting taxes. The record of languages fades in parallel. Linear B, used for palace administration, simply stops. The Hittite cuneiform vanishes. In their place, there is nothing for centuries. Oral tradition filled the gap, carrying myth where inventory once stood. Listeners around Greek hearths heard stories of heroes sailing across a broken sea to recover what was lost. Supporters suggest that the myths of the Trojan War, though embroidered by time, were seeded by these real displacements and conflagrations. Critics counter that such links romanticize a catastrophe, far more mundane, an economic failure rather than an epic one. But the persistence of those tales tells its own truth. When records burn, memory rearranges itself as poetry. Earthquakes may have cleared the ground, but hunger held it. The drought that began in the previous century lingered into the chaos. Without rain, even survivors who escaped the fires faced empty cisterns and brittle fields. Those once rich plains of Anatolia could not feed a standing army anymore. What had been empires of wheat and bronze became empty corridors of dust and flint. In the cracked soil of former vineyards and granaries, the footprint of an age dwindled with each failed planting. A generation later, those same lands incubated smaller societies, tribal, temporary, and self-reliant. Their resilience was born not of abundance, but of loss. To walk through the ruins of Hattusa now is to feel that distance physically. Wind passes through the broken gateways with the same whistle that might have followed the last leaving caravan. The stones are grey under drifting clouds, limestone that once held banners and carvings painted with colour. tourists traced their fingers along the inscriptions of vanished gods. What those letters meant we mostly reconstructed through guesswork. Yet buried below every line of translation is the strange awareness that for centuries no one could read them at all. Civilization, after thriving for 1,000 years, had to learn writing again from scratch. Network theory offers a modern lens on this pattern. Each palace, port, and mine functioned as a node connected by trade. When local shocks hit a few nodes, the network compensated. But once too many failed at once, the load shifted and cascaded, leaving nothing to catch the fall. The Bronze Age collapse, in this view, was the world's first visible systems crash. The palaces, temples, and archives served as processors in an elaborate human machine. When drought and war overloaded it, data, language, art, law disappeared along with the circuitry. The silence that followed was both literal and algorithmic. Centuries later, when the Greeks began forging iron and shaping new city-states, the scar tissue of this collapse still guided them. They built smaller governments, spread power among councils, and relied on local materials instead of distant mines. The lessons, though unspoken, survived through instinct, the recognition that complexity can turn brittle. Out of devastation rose societies harder, simpler, and more flexible. In technology, iron replaced bronze. In politics, towns replaced kingdoms. The Iron Age would inherit not the shine of the past, but the will to survive its absence. Somewhere in that long interlude, the last embers of the Bronze Age cooled. Across Mycenae's citadel, wild olives grew through cracks in the Cyclopean walls. Shepherds turned columns into fence posts. The sound of hammers faded, replaced by goat bells and wind through weeds. Yet under that quiet, the memory of linked trade and shared language waited like a seed bank in dry soil. When the world became stable again, it would sprout differently. The silence that began in the 13th century BCE did not end with the ruins. It shaped our sense of beginnings. What we later call the Greek Renaissance, the poetry, philosophy, and democracy of classical times, rose above the soil that once held a burned archive. Every marble column of later Athens stands atop the ash of the system that came before it. The Bronze Age had built the first version of a connected world, and when it fell, humanity learned how fragile connection could be. Out of that loss, something tougher was forged, an endurance no scribe could have recorded as his walls crumbled around him. When bronze went silent, the survivors turned toward the earth again. All that had once been ignored, ironstone, rough and unglamorous, suddenly mattered. It didn't shine like tin, and it didn't flow as easily through ancient markets. But it was there, beneath their feet, waiting. The first smelters rose not in palaces, but in small, smoky forges behind rebuilt walls. The hammering that followed was duller in tone yet steadier in rhythm, the sound of new beginnings hidden inside collapse. Bronze had bound the world in dependence, its copper and tin scattered across continents. Iron offered release. It could be quarried close to home, smelted in simple clay furnaces fed by charcoal instead of empire. The collapse that fractured trade had left people with no choice but to look inward, and what they found beneath their own soil changed everything quietly. Fragments of slag still found today on forgotten hillsides in Anatolia and Greece mark the first sparks of this transition. Those early fires burned low, fed by bellows carved from animal skin, their smoke carrying the scent of pine resin and iron dust. The shift didn't come quickly. For centuries, iron was temperamental, a stubborn metal that only softened at unbearable heat. The art of coaxing it into shape wasn't born of wealth, but of patience. Small communities learned through trial and error, leaving behind broken tools and warped blades before mastering the chemistry of transformation. In places where shepherds once traded for foreign bronze, local smiths now learned to control the furnace's breath. The glow of molten orange metal in an evening kiln became a symbol of survival on reduced terms. Fewer caravans moved across the desert now, and fewer ships dared the coastlines. But in these quiet forges, the future was already being welded together. Athens, long after its Mycenaean forebears had vanished, began as a village like any other. Its rulers no longer walked marble colonnades. They ruled from timber halls patched with mud brick. Yet such smallness brought balance. Power was harder to centralise when everyone could make a blade or a ploughshare. Governance shifted toward the assembling of equals rather than servants of palaces. Out of that simplicity came something new. City-states. Compact but resilient. Linked not by royal command but by shared methods of survival. Their strength lay not in splendour but in flexibility. Across the Aegean, similar rebirths stirred. In Anatolia, the ashes of the Hittite world hid settlements that reorganised themselves around hilltop citadels. In their workshops, family groups controlled smelting pits. A son who once would have been a bronze merchant now stood over a furnace, learning how iron reacts to varying airflow. The lessons were empirical, passed by hand and by ear. A change in pitch, a flash of colour, the faint hiss when carbon hardened the cooling blade. Pottery fragments near these sites bear black stains where they tested the metal's surface, a fingerprint of adaptation one oxygen molecule at a time. The grace of the new metal wasn't in its beauty, it was in its reliability. Bronze had been noble, sensitive to purity and supply lines. Iron was plain, democratic, and indifferent to distance. It was also tough, so tough that when shaped properly it could survive blows that shattered bronze. Farmers noticed first. Iron ploughshares bit deeper into soil previously guarded by clay. Harvests improved in regions once too stony to till. With better harvests came trade anew, this time on local scales, a marketplace reborn from necessity rather than empire. Languages too reshaped to fit the new rhythm. The palatial linear B of Mycenaean scribes was gone. In its place came the alphabet, efficient, minimal, and portable. The Phoenicians spread it with purpose, simplifying communication as they once traded purple dye. Each sign now represented sound rather than word, freeing literacy from priestly class and turning it into a skill anyone could learn. In the rebuilt harbours of Tyre and Byblos, merchants chalked symbols on amphorae to track routes. Children traced letters on shards. The alphabet carried no divine secrecy. It invited participation. That new literacy paralleled the iron forge itself. Both were systems stripped to essence. The fewer moving parts, the stronger the structure. Centralised archives and hieroglyphic tablets had failed because they required palaces, scribes, and stockpiles. The redesigned world favoured what could survive disconnection. A forge run by a village, a written record held in every hand, both embodied a lesson reluctantly learned from collapse. Complexity had fallen, but understanding deepened. On a warm hillside above a Greek gulf, one can imagine an artisan crouched beside his furnace. His tunic is patched, his kiln low to the ground. He leans forward as small gusts from bellows dance the coals into white heat. Sparks drift upward like insect at dusk. With iron tongs, he pulls out a crude blade, its edge rough, its colour dark as bloodstone. When it cools, he tests it against stone. It leaves a line brighter than any bronze could make. That faint scrape marks a threshold between ages. The transition was uneven and messy. Many regions held onto bronze traditions as long as their stockpiles of tin lasted. In the Levant, coastal workshops produced hybrid tools, bronze handles fitted to iron tips, as metallurgists experimented with blending strength and familiarity. In Egypt, where the Nile's floods still dictated fortune, bronze retained ceremonial value for centuries. But even there, the evidence of adaptation crept in. Excavated tools from late periods show iron nails hidden beneath gilded surfaces, cheap cores masked in insect sheen polish. Even in luxury, practicality was quietly asserting control. Across the wider world, societies that had escaped the Bronze Age crisis entirely, like those in sub-Saharan Africa or central India, were also learning to smelt iron with breathtaking speed. Some whisper these techniques developed independently, harnessing local ores without any inheritance from the Mediterranean. Whether by sharing or coincidence, humanity seemed to converge on the same solution: autonomy through local resource. Globalization had fractured, but innovation was now self-sustaining. Climate, too, played its part in recovery. Where once drought had crushed harvests, a gradual shift towards stability returned seasonal rains to the eastern Mediterranean. The earth exhaled again. Terraces were rebuilt along slopes, irrigation channels reopened. Communities replanted olives and vines where dust had ruled for generations. The return of greenery gave rise to surplus. Surplus invited exchange. But this time, the scale was cautious. Instead of grand fleets, small trading craft crossed short distances. Instead of emperors convening alliances, small councils regulated ports. The lesson of overreach had been engraved in cultural memory. The storytelling changed along with the tools. Myths of lost golden ages circulated, tales of gods struck down or cities swallowed by sea. They were collective memories disguised as legend, the echoes of a generation that watched its parents' palaces crumble. Yet inside those stories grew an ethic of humility. Heroes no longer defied nature, they endured it. The myths of the Iron Age shifted from divine hubris to mortal persistence. Even language reflects endurance. The word for iron in many tongues came to mean not wealth or ornament, but strength. Archaeological layers from this era carry a new simplicity in everyday life. Pottery becomes coarser but more abundant. Homes are smaller, arranged in neighbourhoods rather than compounds. Temples shrink in size but multiply in number. Art favours pattern over portrait, geometry over grandeur. Where Bronze Age artisans cast figurines of gods adorned in hammered gold, Iron Age potters etched circles and meanders, symbols of continuity, of life spiralling but never collapsing again. The aesthetic of survival replaced the architecture of display. One could think of this as humanity decentralizing itself after an early experiment in globalization. Each community became its own microcosm. Instead of a single vast network strained by ambition, there were thousands of smaller circuits capable of surviving isolation. Critics of central rule might say it was the first true test of distributed resilience, a principle that echoes even now in how we design systems of communication and power. A broken empire gave birth to the idea that strength grows best when scattered. In Athens, this pattern of shared foresight evolved into governance. Assemblies replaced kingship. Decisions arose from debate rather than decree. The weapons forged in backyard kilns no longer served distant lords but local defence. Trade returned cautiously, carried by merchants using coins minted from the same iron-rich earth. Civilization had shrunk, but its core became sturdier. When disruption came again centuries later, from Persians, from Romans, the framework of independent cities helped Greece endure far longer than its Bronze Age ancestors. In the Near East, the great Assyrian realm later rediscovered the art of command, but even its armies relied on iron's logic: strong, inexpensive, replicable. Soldiers no longer fought with treasured individual swords, but with standardized blades produced by state-controlled kilns. The technology of equality turned again into a tool of empire, yet the memory of collapse lingered, visible in the careful documentation of grain storage, in the new emphasis on redundancy. Empires would rise again, but they carried the DNA of that ancient failure within them. Back in the Aegean hills, artisans continued refining their craft, learning to temper iron with carbon. The accidental discovery of steel transformed mundane black metal into something nearly divine. Blade edges took polish. Tools stayed sharp for seasons. The mastery of this process was slow but relentless, transmitted by apprentices who might never leave their valleys yet, were connected by shared method rather than shared rule. Knowledge had gone viral centuries before the word existed. Writing followed similar lines. The Phoenician alphabet inspired Greek adaptation, leading to new forms of expression. Simplicity encouraged creativity. Records of trade, verse and law all multiplied. What had vanished in the silent centuries now roared softly back. Language open to anyone with patience to learn it. The ability to read and write no longer depended on royal scribal schools. It belonged to merchants, sailors, farmers. Literacy was becoming democratic at the same pace as metallurgic skill. Survival was knowledge now, not inheritance. From the wreckage of the bronze network grew a culture that valued systems which could breathe instead of break. Iron rusted, yes, but it was cheap to replace. Alphabets changed, but they were easy to copy. Cities fell and were rebuilt because no single monument anchored all identity. Humanity had learned, painfully, that perfection was brittle and abundance precarious. Imperfection, on the other hand, allowed repair. Some scholars say this shift set the mental groundwork for the philosophies that would later define classical thought. A species that once measured value in metals and trade now began asking about order, balance, and justice. Those questions came from memory, the quiet warning carried by ancestors who had watched global markets collapse when the rain stopped. Their descendants no longer prayed only for triumph, but for endurance. The faith of the Iron Age was steadiness. As the centuries turned, the scars of the Great Collapse faded under new stone foundations. Iron tools carved states and stories from land that had once gone lifeless. The brilliance of gold returned eventually, but this time as embellishment, not dependence. By then, the idea of resilience was built into the world's infrastructure, the small replaceable parts that together weathered change. The world that emerged from bronze's ashes was harder to dazzle, but far harder to break. It carried its fragility openly, like an old scar that had healed too neatly to forget. And as centuries passed, fleets took once more to the sea, trade routes quietly knitting themselves together, simpler, wiser, still haunted by the memory of fire. The collapse of the Bronze Age world was not one disaster, but a pattern of interlocking failures, a system folding in on itself. When archaeologists sift through the ruins of Ugarit or Hattusa, they find no single smoking ruin that explains it all. They find layers of halted correspondence, half-finished repairs, and traces of hurried departures. It suggests something deeper, an invisible web stretched so tight that the breaking of one strand sent tremors through the rest. That is why many modern researchers describe that age not as an era of empires, but as one vast living network, complex, dazzling, and ultimately unstable. Modern network theory, developed thousands of years later for computers and social systems, offers a strange echo of that ancient entanglement. Each node in a network, whether a city, a server, or a shipping port, depends on others for balance. The more connected those points become, the faster ideas and wealth move. But that same density means a single break can ripple everywhere. In the language of mathematics, it's called a cascading failure. In the language of history, it's called collapse. The same rules that govern how a blackout passes through a power grid once governed the way drought rippled through Egyptian grain stores and toppled the palaces of Greece. Picture a trade route as a line of energy. Tin mined in Afghanistan moved west through mountain passes. Copper came from Cyprus, grain from the Nile. Together they fueled economies across thousands of miles. When rain faltered and rivers shrank, the Nile's surplus vanished first. Without bread, Egypt's partners went hungry. Famine meant fewer hands in the fields, fewer goods for trade, fewer ships to carry them. The pattern began as scarcity and ended as war. Each kingdom, believing its crisis was local, unknowingly pulled a vital thread from the global fabric, making the whole weaker. This cause and effect is something computer scientists illustrate now with models, each virtual nation represented by a dot in digital space, its survival balanced on connections of trade or data flow. Remove too many links and the model freezes. In real life, the Bronze Age reached that threshold quietly. The ports of Ugarit once catalogued entire fleets setting sail each season. Toward the end, the records taper off to nothing. It wasn't an abrupt stop. It was a slow fading of signal, like a network losing bandwidth until the screens go black. One broken link becomes another kingdom's famine, then another's invasion. That's the secret rhythm of cascading collapse. A merchant waiting on tin cannot pay the soldier guarding his caravan. The soldier, unpaid, deserts. The city he once protected now becomes vulnerable to raiders desperate for the same resources, who in turn push refugees into neighbouring lands, triggering fresh waves of conflict. It unfolds the way a feedback loop does in an unstable system, each reaction amplifying the next. The ancient world discovered the danger of being too connected long before anyone put that warning into code or theory. Eric Klein and other modern historians have spent years tracing this chain reaction through archaeological data and climate studies. Their interpretation paints a picture both scientific and haunting. Civilizations bound by dependence, undone by the same. They describe how small shocks, earthquakes, shifts in weather, temporary shortages, combined until even the strongest administration could not recalibrate. What fascinates scholars now is that the Bronze Age world recovered many times before. Floods had come and gone, famines had scarred valleys before prosperity returned. But around 1200 BCE, the shocks came in faster succession, leaving no interval for repair. Resilience itself broke down. From a distance of 3,000 years, the pattern feels familiar. Our own age of container ships, data cables and supply chains echoes that ancient network of copper and grain. Goods still flow from specific regions. Rare earth metals from remote mines, oil from desert fields, grain from black-soiled plains. Each link strengthens comfort while building dependency. A storm shutters one port and factories an ocean away slow to silence. When viewed through this lens, the fall of late Bronze Age empires reads almost like an early case study in globalization's fragility. The difference is scale. The principle is the same. Think of a small glitch in a modern system. A social platform losing a server, a stock exchange freezing for an hour, or a tanker wedged in a narrow canal. Each episode exposes how much of daily stability hangs on invisible threads. In the ancient world, those threads were literal. Ropes binding ships, caravans winding through salt deserts, scribes sending tablets that took weeks to arrive. Today, the threads are digital, moving faster and more silently. Yet the pattern behind their movement hasn't changed. Dependence is still the first sign of connection, and connection is the seed of vulnerability. Scientists who study complexity sometimes illustrate this with ecosystems. Remove one keystone species, a pollinator, a predator, and the rest of the web sways. For Bronze Age societies, that species might as well have been the climate itself. When rainfall declined, it was as though nature had withdrawn its central node. Farmers produced less grain, warehouses emptied, towns reliant on imported food began to scatter. As that condition spread from one region to another, each reacting individually but simultaneously, it magnified into a synchronized failure. Under layers of dust and ash, archaeologists still read the symmetry of that breakdown in carbonized grain pits and abandoned ports. It's tempting to imagine the collapse as a single tragic event, a day when palaces burned and markets fell silent forever. But the true descent likely felt more confusing than catastrophic. A trader at Byblos might have still expected the next shipment to arrive any week now. A farmer in Anatolia might have planted as usual, believing the rains delayed rather than gone. The human brain, wired for continuity, rarely perceives systemic change until it's irreversible. In that way, empathy bridges the gulf between then and now. People of the Bronze Age didn't know their world was ending. They thought it was simply experiencing another difficult season. Link theory, ironically, helps explain why ancient communication slowed as crises deepened. Each palace relied on scribes, runners, and messengers to keep track of debts and promises. As wars began to break supply lines, those networks clogged. Letters that once arrived in weeks now took months, or never came. Without information, leaders could no longer coordinate relief or defence. In a sense, their bandwidth collapsed before their economies did. The flow of data, then written on clay instead of transmitted by fibre, was the first system to fail. What followed was material decay, but the silence started with lost messages. Critics of this analogy caution that connectivity is not always dangerous, that societies also survive through cooperation. They argue that Bronze Age resilience might have returned had the climate stabilised sooner. Others counter that the true lesson lies in balance. Dense networks demand redundant links, so that one broken route does not doom a continent. The ancient empires had no redundancy. They built no backups for scarcity. Their power was stored in the continuity of ships and seasons. When both faltered, nothing stood beneath. It's that structural void, rather than mere misfortune, that turns crisis into collapse. Look at the map of that age. The court of Egypt, the citadels of Mycenae, the fortresses of the Hittites, the harbours of the Levant. Every site sits along an exchange route. Every economy was conditioned by what another could provide. When archaeologists compare the radiocarbon dates of their destruction layers, they find the fires occurred within decades of each other. The distances are vast, yet the timing is narrow. It's a pattern too consistent to be coincidence, though not coordinated either. That simultaneity defines systems failure, separate entities collapsing together though no single cause unites them. It happened once with palaces, it can happen now with markets. In the language of modern risk analysis, the Bronze Age network operated near its threshold of complexity. Growth created more dependencies than it could maintain, a problem mirrored by modern supply and energy chains. Each new alliance brought hidden fragility. When drought cut access to one commodity, the others folded in sequence. Researchers who model these systems describe a tipping point where the cost of maintaining connections exceeds their benefit. The Bronze Age lived at that edge for centuries, thriving until a minor shift pushed it past. Some whisper that such collapses are cyclical, that every 2,000 or 3,000 years, climate change and overextension synchronize again. While evidence remains debated, the pattern tempts the imagination. Ice core data show regular intervals of extreme dryness across the Mediterranean world, and certain scholars align these pulses with waves of upheaval, the migration age, the medieval crises, the modern era of instability. Whether coincidence or rhythm, the idea unsettles because it implies recurrence rather than rarity. Civilizations build webs anew, forget the weakness, and repeat the same intricate mistake. You can sense the irony. Progress seeks to connect, yet every connection adds weight to potential failure. The Bronze Age found this out the hard way. Trade and communication created prosperity measured in gold and grain, but no one thought to question whether the flow could stop. Now we measure our wealth in data and energy instead, still assuming expansion means security. Perhaps the real wisdom lies not in how long we can stretch the web, but how gently we can absorb the shock when it shakes. The mathematician studying complex systems today traces equations on a whiteboard that could just as well diagram the Bronze Age timeline. The archaeologist brushes dirt from a shattered storage jar that once held foreign grain. Both are reading different languages of the same phenomenon. One calls it feedback instability, the other calls it history. In both, resilience hinges on diversity, multiple paths, local autonomy, flexible response. The Bronze Age had brilliance, art and science, but little flexibility. It built one road to prosperity and watched that road dry to dust. It's difficult to say whether any warning could have stopped the fall. Communication lagged. Belief was anchored in divine order, not systemic correction. When kings saw famine, They blamed rebellion or neglected rituals, not ecological imbalance. Their worldview made self-adjustment impossible because the gods, not human actions, controlled abundance. Perhaps that is the most sobering parallel. When societies interpret crisis as temporary, they wait instead of adapt. Waiting was fatal then. It is risky now. Today, satellite charts and algorithms give us the foresight no scribe could dream of. We can see storms before they form, track trade bottlenecks in real time, and test global resilience on simulated platforms. Yet our challenges rhyme with those of Ugarit or Thebes: climate volatility, resource strain, mass displacement. The difference lies in knowledge, not immunity. Complexity theory warns that prediction doesn't prevent collapse, it only buys preparation time. It's still up to people, hands, choices, small adaptive acts, to decide whether a shock becomes a fall or a transformation. The world that emerged after the Bronze Age learned painful lessons without naming them. Decentralized city-states became less dependent on distant trade. Metal workers learned to smelt iron from local stone, securing autonomy. Writing returned in simpler alphabets. These were acts of recovery disguised as innovation. When viewed through the structure of network theory, they represent the same adaptation engineers encourage today: distribute load, shorten links, increase redundancy. Ancient progress was not about reinventing technology but redistributing risk. For a moment, let the frame widen. Patterns like these recur not because humanity forgets facts, but because it forgets feel, the memory of scarcity, of thin harvests, of silence after trade ceases. Evidence suggests Bronze Age survivors carried fragments of that memory forward, buried in mythic form. Floods, lost golden ages, cities swallowed by sea. Each story, told again around later fires, was a code for systemic fragility. They could not model the equations, so they whispered the moral instead. Everything linked must also bend. Perhaps that is the note to leave hovering in the air. The ancient collapse still murmurs across time, not as prophecy but as reminder. When one part of a system fails, the vibration travels farther than expected. And though thousands of years have passed since palaces burned and letters stopped arriving, the hum of connection sounds the same. The only question is how well we hear it before our own web begins to strain. The first global economy ended not with conquest, but with silence. For centuries, bronze tied coastlines together like threads through cloth, and when those threads snapped, nothing replaced them for hundreds of years. You can almost feel the quiet that followed, the still heat on stone, the faint trails where caravans once cut through dust. The collapse didn't erase humanity, it reset it, forcing people to rediscover how to live small again, how to grow grain by hand when trade and tribute no longer arrived with the tide. That reset turned loss into adaptation. It's the same pattern our own networks whisper about today, when signals falter and ports fall still. Every generation builds its web a little wider, trusting that distance no longer matters, but history suggests it always does. Resilience, perhaps, isn't found in stretching further, but in remembering how to mend the break. The Bronze Age kingdoms never learned that in time. They mistook scale for strength. Their fall wasn't a punishment, it was feedback. And within that feedback lives a question we keep avoiding. If everything depends on everything else, what happens when one link cools to grey? Our climate records, satellites and glowing dashboards might make us think we've solved fragility, yet the echoes of that ancient drought hum beneath it all. Supply lines, data cables, power grids, they carry the same illusion of permanence Egypt and Ugarit once did. The lesson that travels forward through the dust is simple, though it rarely feels comforting. Systems end quietly. They don't always explode. They fade, reconfigure, and wait to be rebuilt by whoever endures. History, like metal, can fracture, but it can also be reforged. The dart between ages isn't an ending. It's the forge cooling before the next dawn's heat.